My grandfather's hands never shook. Even at 76, he could handle a boat through the chop in Barkley Sound without gripping the wheel too hard. He was that kind of steady, the kind you build a life around. So when the RCMP called me at 6:14 on a Tuesday morning to say his truck had gone off the highway east of Hope, that the brake line had apparently failed on a downhill curve, that both he and my grandmother were gone, I stood in my kitchen in East Vancouver and held the phone against my chest for a full minute before I could say a word. My name is Maya. I am 36 years old. I work as a forensic accountant for a mid-sized firm in Vancouver. I had spent the better part of my adult life learning to read numbers the way other people read faces, looking for what they were trying to hide. I never imagined I would need that skill to survive my own family. The funeral was held 4 days later at a small Anglican church in Cowichan Bay on Vancouver Island. My grandfather had built Heron Point Lodge just 12 kilometers up the coast. 42 years of work, a place he and my grandmother had made from bare land and borrowed money and absolute stubbornness. The whole valley came out for the service. My grandmother had taught piano lessons to half the kids in the district. My grandfather had hired more local contractors than any developer in the region. People cried who hadn't cried at their own parents' funerals. I sat in the front pew. My brother was 3 rows back. He had driven down from Vancouver with his wife, my sister-in-law, who was a corporate lawyer, Bay Street trained, though she had moved west 3 years ago and set up a commercial litigation practice in the city. She wore a charcoal blazer to the funeral. Not black charcoal, I noticed. The estate lawyer, a quiet man from Victoria named Mr. Whitfield, met with the immediate family the evening after the burial. He read my grandfather's will in the sitting room of Heron Point Lodge, with the ocean visible through the west-facing windows and the smell of cedars still in the walls. My grandfather had left the lodge, the business operating accounts, and a portfolio of registered and non-registered investments totaling just over $8 million, all of it to me, solely and entirely to me. Under the Wills, Estates and Succession Act, the transfer was clean and complete. Mr. Whitfield was very precise about that. My brother's face went very still when Mr. Whitfield finished reading. My sister-in-law's did not. She reached into the leather document bag she had carried in. Who brings a document bag to a will reading, and pulled out a thick stapled filing. She set it on the coffee table with both hands, flat, like she was dealing a card. This is an injunction filed this morning with the BC Supreme Court, my sister-in-law said. Her voice was completely even. She had that lawyer's trick of sounding bored while she was cutting your throat. Under the interim order, your brother is named executor pending a challenge to the validity of the existing will. Heron Point Lodge has been identified as the primary estate asset and is subject to an immediate management freeze. You'll need to vacate the residential quarters by Friday. I looked at the papers. I did not touch them. My brother leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, looking at the rug. He still couldn't meet my eyes. This isn't personal, Maya. The lodge has been running at a loss for 2 years. Granddad's health was slipping. He wasn't making sound decisions anymore. We need to restructure to protect the asset value. Running at a loss, I said. The financials don't lie. That was almost funny, coming from him. I had seen enough manipulated financials in my career to know exactly what they looked like. But I kept my face neutral and my hands loose in my lap. I had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing you can do in a high-stakes room is let the other side know what you know. My mother, who had been sitting near the window with a glass of wine she had poured herself without offering anyone else, set the glass down with a click. Maya, please don't make this difficult, she said. Your grandfather loved you. This isn't about that. This is about the family not losing everything because of a sentimental decision made by an old man who should have updated his will 5 years ago. Your brother has the business sense. You're good at your work, but this is different. Let him handle it. Let him handle it. I had been hearing that my entire life. Meanwhile, I had put myself through university, taken out a student line of credit for my CPA courses, and spent 7 years building a professional reputation entirely on my own, without a cent from either of my parents, who had happily co-signed my brother's first business loan and paid his MBA tuition without a second thought. I stood up, I picked up the injunction filing. My sister-in-law's eyes tracked my hand, ready to object. I walked to the wood stove in the corner of the sitting room, the same cast-iron stove my grandfather had installed himself in 1987, opened the front door and slid the entire filing inside. The paper caught in under 4 seconds. Dead silence. "You understand that was filed with the court," my sister-in-law said. Her voice had gone flat and cold. "You understand I'll be speaking to Mr. Whitfield about the validity of that filing before 7 o'clock tomorrow morning," I said. "And if I were you, I'd start worrying less about this lodge, and more about what happens when the Canada Revenue Agency finishes looking at whatever it is you've been running through numbered company 1247893 BC Limited." I watched my brother's face. That was the tell I was looking for. He went the color of old concrete. "You have until 9 o'clock tomorrow to be off this property," I said. "I'll have fresh towels put outside your door tonight." I walked out of the sitting room, climbed the stairs to my grandfather's private study, and locked the door behind me. I did not sleep. I made a pot of coffee, the same dark roast my grandfather had shipped in from a small batch roaster in the Okanagan every month for 20 years, and sat at his desk in the dark for a while before I turned the lamp on. My grandfather was not sentimental with paperwork. He was methodical. Every drawer in that desk was labeled. Every folder was dated. I worked through the filing cabinet first, then the bookshelves, then the locked bottom drawer whose key I found taped to the underside of the center drawer. Inside was a fireproof document box, gray steel combination lock. I tried his birthday, nothing. I tried my grandmother's birthday. The lock clicked open on the second rotation. Inside, a USB drive sealed in a small resealable bag, a handwritten letter addressed to me, and a business card. The card had a name and a direct phone number, with a note beneath it in my grandfather's tight, careful printing: Cray Special Investigations. Call only when they pushed past the line. I read the letter first. My grandfather had been aware of the numbered company for 14 months. He had suspected what was happening to the lodge's operating revenue: the gradual disappearance of corporate bookings, the unexplained management fees, the inflated contractor invoices that didn't match any work he could see. He had hired a private forensic accountant in Victoria to trace it. He hadn't confronted anyone yet because he wanted the full picture. He was always certain before he moved. He was not certain in time. I plugged the USB drive into my laptop. The files were organized with the precision of a man who had spent 40 years running a tight operation. Spreadsheets, scanned invoices, bank statements, a detailed report from the private accountant. I read for 2 hours. By the time I sat back, my hands were steady, but my jaw ached from holding it closed. My brother and my sister-in-law had incorporated 1247893 BC Limited, a numbered company with no visible connection to either of their names, 18 months ago. They had been routing management and consulting fees from Heron Point Lodge's operating account into that numbered company. The total extracted over 14 months was just over $400,000. The money had then moved in tranches to an account in the Cayman Islands, and from there into high-risk equity positions that had largely collapsed. They hadn't stolen from my grandfather to get rich. They had stolen to cover up previous losses. A second set of books showed my brother's personal investment portfolio had been underwater for 3 years. I almost closed the laptop, then I noticed the last folder on the drive, labeled with a date, 6 days before the accident. Inside was a single scanned document, a repair invoice from a small automotive shop in Abbotsford. The invoice listed routine maintenance on my grandfather's truck. The name of the mechanic who had signed off on the work was highlighted in yellow. My grandfather had highlighted it himself with a sticky note in his handwriting: cross-reference e-transfer, OC3. I went back through the bank statements. On October 3rd, 10 days before the crash, my brother's numbered company had sent an e-transfer of $22,000 to a personal account. The account holder's name matched the mechanic who had signed the repair invoice. The brake line had failed. The mechanic had been paid $22,000. The crash happened on October 13th. I set down my coffee mug very carefully. I looked at the wall for a long time. I thought about my grandfather's hands, how steady they had always been. I thought about my grandmother who used to sing while she dried dishes, who had called me every Sunday for 12 years without missing once. Then I picked up the business card and dialed the number. The woman who answered had a measured, careful voice, the kind that has heard everything and still manages to hear it one more time without flinching. I gave her the phrase my grandfather had written in the letter. There was a pause, and then she told me her name was Inspector Holt, and that her team had been monitoring the numbered company for 11 months. I told her about the mechanic's invoice and the e-transfer. There was a longer pause. That crosses it from tax fraud and embezzlement to something else entirely, she said. Stay in the lodge. Don't tell anyone you've been in contact with us. We will have a presence on site by 8:45 tomorrow morning. If your brother and his wife attempt to access the premises before then, call 911 and stall. I told her I could manage that. I went to bed at 4 in the morning and slept for 3 hours. When I woke up, I put on the best suit I had brought, the one I wore when testifying as an expert witness. I made a fresh pot of the Okanagan roast. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the mist come off Satellite Channel while I waited. At 8:30, gravel crunched in the driveway. My brother arrived in his wife's Audi. Behind it was a second vehicle, a black SUV, tinted windows, with 2 men who got out wearing cargo pants and heavy boots. They were not law enforcement. My sister-in-law had hired private security. My mother arrived in a cab. She was wearing sunglasses despite the overcast sky, a Tim Hortons coffee in her hand, and the specific expressions of someone who believes they are about to witness an unpleasant necessity. My brother pointed at the front door of the lodge. One of the security contractors started toward the steps. I opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch with my coffee mug. Everyone stopped. My sister-in-law recovered first. She walked forward holding a second copy of the court filing, and her voice was flat and businesslike. The Friday deadline was a courtesy, Maya. You burned a legal document last night. That's obstruction. We are here under court authority. Step aside. That injunction was filed on fraudulent grounds, I said. Mr. Whitfield has already contacted the court registry this morning. You want to be very careful about what happens in the next 60 seconds. My brother stepped forward, his voice cracked with someone who had been awake all night. We are taking possession of this property today. It does not have to be like this. You're right, I said. It doesn't. The side door of the lodge opened behind me. The woman who stepped out wore a dark jacket with an RCMP badge on her belt. Behind her, 2 more officers came around the corner of the building. From the tree line at the edge of the property, 3 additional figures in tactical vests emerged and took positions. A 4th person, a man in a plain navy suit carrying a document case, came around from the parking area. My sister-in-law's face went white. Constables, please secure the perimeter, Inspector Holt said calmly, walking up beside me. She looked at my brother and my sister-in-law with the unhurried expression of someone who has done this many times. I'll need you both to remain where you are. The 2 gentlemen from the security firm can put their hands where I can see them and step back to their vehicle. The security contractors complied immediately. They had been hired for intimidation, not for confrontation with the RCMP. My mother set her coffee cup down on the hood of the cab, which was still idling in the driveway, and seemed to have forgotten it was in her hand. This is an abuse of process, my sister-in-law said. We have a valid court order. Your court order was issued without disclosing material facts, Inspector Holt said. Specifically, the existence of 12,47893 BC Limited, your role as a beneficial owner, and the $411,000 routed through that company from Heron Point Lodge operating accounts over the past 14 months. She nodded toward the man in the navy suit, who opened his document case. The Canada Revenue Agency has completed its preliminary audit and obtained a production order. All accounts associated with the numbered company, your personal accounts, and your husband's investment accounts were frozen at 9 o'clock this morning. My brother sat down on the hood of the Audi. He just sat down as if his legs had stopped working. I stepped forward and looked at my sister-in-law directly. The mechanic in Abbotsford, I said. The one your numbered company paid $22,000 on October 3rd. That e-transfer is in the CRA's possession. So is the repair invoice my grandfather flagged. And so is the analysis his private accountant completed. The one that places that payment 10 days before a brake failure on a truck that had just been certified as roadworthy. I kept my voice level. They were my grandparents. Something shifted in her expression. For the first time, the composure cracked at the edges. My brother made a sound I had never heard from a human being before. He pressed both hands over his face and bent forward over his knees on the hood of the car. Inspector Holt gave a signal. 2 officers moved forward. My sister-in-law was read her rights in clear, unhurried French and English, both official languages properly delivered, while the officers secured her hands. My brother stood when they came to him. He didn't fight it. He looked at me once with an expression I could not fully name. It was not quite grief and not quite remorse, and then he looked at the ground. My mother stood in the driveway with her hands pressed flat to the sides of her coat and watched her son being walked to a police vehicle. She did not cry. She looked like a woman calculating her next move. I knew that look. The next 3 weeks were the quietest and most dangerous stretch of the whole ordeal. My brother and my sister-in-law were in remand custody pending bail. The Crown had opposed bail given the flight risk, and the CRA had handed the criminal investigation to the Integrated Homicide Investigation Team. The brake tampering allegation was being treated as suspected homicide. The mechanic in Abbotsford had already retained a lawyer. My mother was not in custody. There were no grounds to hold her yet, and a free, desperate woman with a mobile phone is never truly harmless. I found out what she was doing when my younger sister called me from her house in Kelowna at midnight, her voice shaking. My sister and her husband, my brother-in-law Ezra, who ran a small architectural firm in the Okanagan, had been deliberately kept out of the family drama. My sister had always been the quiet one, the one who survived our family by staying small and agreeable. But she called me, and her voice was shaking. She came all the way from the city today, my sister said. She brought a document for me to sign. It was a medical affidavit, Maya. She wants me to swear that you've been unstable since the funeral. She said if you get declared mentally unfit, she can apply for interim guardianship of the estate. I closed my eyes, of course. Did you sign it? No, my sister's voice steadied. Ezra took it out of my hands before I could. He was very calm about it. He recorded everything on his phone after the first few minutes. She made a lot of threats. About his business? About his business license. She said she knew people on the city planning board in Kelowna. She said she'd have his firm blacklisted across the province. I told my sister to go to her in-laws' place in Summerland and to send me the audio file tonight. I called Mr. Whitfield's emergency line. At 7 the next morning, I was in the office of a senior estates litigation lawyer in Victoria named Miss Farquhar, who had a reputation for not losing. Within 48 hours, I had completed 3 independent psychological assessments, 2 with clinicians in Victoria and 1 via secure video with a specialist in Vancouver. All 3 produced the same finding. I was not just competent. The third assessor noted in his written report that my level of analytical function under acute family stress was exceptional and not consistent with any recognized pattern of impairment. Ms. Farquhar filed a preemptive motion in BC Supreme Court to dismiss any incoming guardianship or committee application before it could gain traction. She attached the 3 assessments, the audio recording of my mother threatening my brother-in-law's livelihood, and the bank records showing my personal financial history, including the registered investment accounts I had built entirely independently, without a cent of family money. The hearing was 2 weeks later. My mother walked into BC Supreme Court in Victoria wearing a grey wool dress and an expression of rehearsed devastation. She had found a lawyer, a retired civil litigator named Mr. Grantham from Nanaimo, who looked slightly out of his depth but willing to take the case. She sat at the applicant's table and folded her hands. I sat across from her with Miss Farquhar and said nothing. Mr. Grantham's opening was polished enough. He spoke about a daughter in crisis following a traumatic double loss, about impulsive financial decisions, and he presented my burning of the original injunction filing as evidence of erratic behavior. The judge, a woman who had clearly seen every variation of family estate litigation in her career, listened with polite neutrality. Then Miss Farquhar stood up. She submitted the 3 psychiatric assessments. She submitted the audio recording, admissible, because it had been recorded in a private residence by a participant in the conversation, which is entirely legal in Canada. She played the section where my mother told my brother-in-law, clearly and without ambiguity, that she would use her connections to have his professional license obstructed if he did not help her force me into a guardianship proceeding. She then pulled up the BC Land Registry records showing my personal purchase of a small commercial property in Langford 3 years ago, bought with my own savings, currently leased at fair market rent, alongside an independent assessment of the Heron Point Lodge books, which showed the lodge had been profitable until 14 months ago, when the unauthorized management fees began draining the operating account. The application before this court is not a welfare concern, Ms. Farquhar said. It is the continuation of an asset extraction scheme that began while my client's grandfather was alive. When that scheme was exposed by the RCMP and the CRA, the applicant pivoted to a secondary strategy: have my client declared legally incompetent so that she, as the proposed committee, could assume control of an $8 million estate. Mr. Grantham objected. The judge overruled him without looking up. When my mother took the stand, she wept. She was very good at it. She spoke about her fear for me, her grief over her parents. Her voice broke in exactly the right places. I had watched her do this at family dinners when the bill arrived at a restaurant she didn't want to pay for. I watched the judge's face instead. The judge was not moved. But Miss Farker had also called Ezra as a witness. He walked to the stand with the ease of someone accustomed to giving presentations to municipal planning committees and unimpressed by courtrooms. He described exactly what my mother had said. He confirmed the recording was accurate, and then, at Ms. Farker's prompting, he described a second conversation, one that had taken place at my parents' house 2 years ago, which he had committed to a sworn affidavit after reviewing the audio jogged his memory. At that dinner, my mother had discussed, in front of him, apparently assuming he was not paying attention, the possibility of having me assessed by a private psychiatrist who could provide a diagnosis to support a guardianship application. This had been discussed not as a concern for my well-being, but as a contingency plan in the event my grandfather ever named me as the primary beneficiary. They had been planning this for 2 years. The judge did not dismiss the proceedings when that affidavit was read into the record. She paused, removed her glasses, set them on the bench, and looked at my mother. I am forwarding this transcript and the evidentiary record to the Law Society of British Columbia, the judge said, with specific reference to the involvement of legal counsel in what appears to have been a premeditated scheme to falsely establish a psychiatric basis for a committee application. Additionally, I am referring the audio recording to the Crown for review as potential evidence in the ongoing criminal investigation. Mr. Grantham quietly gathered his papers and did not look at my mother. My mother was not handcuffed in the courtroom, but she walked out of that building alone, into a gray November afternoon on Superior Street, and I watched through the window as she stood on the steps for a while, not moving, her phone in her hand, before she turned and walked toward Douglas Street without looking back. In the hallway outside, Ezra was waiting with my sister, who had driven down from Kelowna that morning. She held on to me for a long time without saying anything. When she stepped back, her eyes were wet, but her chin was up. "We're done," she said, "with all of it, we decided." Ezra shook my hand. He had the manner of someone who had been waiting a long time to say something and had chosen his moment carefully. "Your grandfather deserved better from this family," he said. "We're glad we could help." I told them what I meant. They had given me exactly what I needed, exactly when I needed it. I told them to go home, go back to their lives, and not look over their shoulders anymore. The nightmare was over and it would stay over. 14 months later, I drove up the coast road to Heron Point Lodge on a Thursday afternoon in January. The renovation had taken 6 months. I had hired the same local contractor my grandfather had used for years and kept as much of the original structure as possible: the cedar walls, the cast iron stove, the west-facing windows. What I added was a small conference facility for corporate retreats and a proper commercial kitchen. Heron Point now ran at full capacity for 9 months of the year and had a wait list for summer weekends. In the autumn, I had sat down with Miss Farquhar and Mr. Whitfield and established a small grant program through the estate trust. The Dorothy and Harold Fund, named for my grandparents, provided seed capital and legal support to women in British Columbia navigating estate disputes or financial abuse by family members. The first 3 recipients were announced in December. The applications for the spring cohort had already exceeded what we could fund this year, and I was working on changing that. My brother was awaiting trial on charges of fraud, breach of trust, and conspiracy relating to the deaths of my grandparents. The Crown was proceeding by indictment. My sister-in-law had entered a plea arrangement in exchange for testimony. The mechanic in Abbotsford had done the same. My mother had not been charged. There was not yet sufficient evidence to connect her directly to the criminal conspiracy, though the investigation remained open. She had lost her standing in the social circles that had mattered so much to her, not through any action of mine, but because those circles do not maintain membership for people associated with suspected murder for inheritance cases. She had sold the condo in False Creek. From what I understood, she was living somewhere outside the province. She had not contacted me. I stood at the kitchen window of the lodge with a cup of the Okanagan roast, watching a heron work the shallows at the edge of the property. My grandfather had told me there was always a heron on that stretch of shoreline, year-round, one generation following the next in the same territory. He said it was the same bird. He knew it wasn't, but he liked believing it was. I thought about steadiness, about what it costs to build something carefully and what it costs to destroy it quickly, and how those two things are never in balance. I thought about my grandmother's voice on the phone every Sunday for 12 years. I thought about my grandfather's handwriting on that sticky note, call only when they push past the line, looking exactly the same at 76 as it had on birthday cards when I was 8. He had trusted me with everything he built because I was the only one who had never tried to take it from him. I set down my mug and went back to my desk. There was work to do and I had always been good at it.